Everyone, welcome to meeting number 134 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates. As we all know, it has the mighty OGGO. I'd like to welcome everyone. Just a quick reminder to everyone to keep your earpieces away from your microphones at all times so we avoid feedback that harms our very valuable interpreters who we cannot operate without. Before we start, if you just oblige me, colleagues, I want to just pay tribute to three members of Parliament who've passed recently who were integral in getting OGGO operating years ago. MP Marlene Tattersall, who was from Ottawa, West Nepean, Mr. John Williams, who was from Edmonton, St. Albert, and Chuck Stroll from BC, Chilliwack area. The three of them saw a need for better oversight of government spending in the estimates process, so started the process back in a joint report to PROC in 1998, recognizing that vast sums of money spent by the government are subjected to only perfunctory parliamentary scrutiny. They got a report through to PROC, and then Mr. Stroll managed to get it tabled in PROC and passed. It led to the creation of what has become the mighty OGGO. So I just want to take a moment and thank you, everyone, that we recognize the passing of our three valued colleagues who were so important in the service of Canada. So thank you very much for that, colleagues, and to the families of Ms. Tattersall, Mr. Williams, Mr. Stroll. We'd like to pass along condolences from the members of OGGO and the staff and clerk and analysts, I'm sure, as well. So thank you very much. We're starting off with 5 minutes from Ms. Tattersall from TBS, and then we will go online to Mr. Quinlan. The floor is yours. Oh, just quickly, an hour and a half in, we will take a short break for the witnesses and the staff to attend to issues. But go ahead, Ms. Tattersall. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I would like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. My name is Samantha Tattersall. I am the Assistant Controller General for the Acquired Services and Assets sector in the Office of Controller General at the Treasury Board Secretariat. First, I'd like to take a moment to outline the role that Treasury Board Secretariat plays in supporting the management of investments, specifically real property. Le Conseil de Trésor établit le cadre.
The Treasury Board sets the administrative policy framework for the management of investments, including real property, through the Directive on the Management of Real Property. Custodian departments, of which there are 28 across the federal government, including Global Affairs Canada, are responsible for the management of their real property. Deputy heads of these organizations are accountable for ensuring that real property is managed in a manner that enables operational outcomes while demonstrating sound stewardship. Consistent with Treasury Board policy, custodian organizations must have a senior designated official responsible for the management of real property who is accountable for establishing, implementing, and maintaining a department-wide real property management framework. This framework should include effective governance and oversight mechanisms to effectively enable the management of real property that supports the delivery of their respective departmental mandates.
Transaction, whether that is to lease, to acquire, or dispose of real property, Treasury Board approval is required when the value exceeds a department's transaction limits. All custodian departments have general limits, and 8 have special limits that are reflective of their operational requirements. And this information is available online on canada.ca. In the case of Global Affairs Canada, the department can acquire official residence property outside of Canada for an amount of up to 10 million Canadian. So this means that the property in question was acquired within Global Affairs Canada's authority. The Treasury Board did not review the transaction in question. Regardless of whether the transaction is within or above a department's limits, they need to transact in a manner that is consistent with the directive on the management of real property. So this includes validating the need for an acquisition based on their department's programs. It's supported by the appropriate due diligence, including a full life cycle analysis. It's done in a fair and open manner that's aligned with commercial real estate practices, and that an appraisal from the Chief Appraiser of Canada is obtained in advance of the purchase. With that, Mr. Chair, I'm pleased to answer any questions from the committee members about the Treasury Board Directive on the management of real property.
Thank you very much. Mr. Quinlan, go ahead, please.
Alors, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senior Assistant Deputy Minister for Real Property Services at Public Services and Procurement Canada, and I'm pleased to discuss our limited role in the transaction process for the Canadian Consul General's residence in New York City. In order to comply with the Treasury Board Directive on the management of real property, real estate practitioners from custodian departments are required, as part of their due diligence process, to justify the amount paid for acquisitions and disposals in relation to market value. Plus précisément, conformément aux procédures.
Specifically, according to the procedure set out in Appendix B to the directive, practitioners must obtain at least one appraisal from the Chief Appraiser of Canada before acquiring or disposing of real property, except when there will be an open solicitation of offers and the total value of the real property interest is anticipated to be less than $500,000. In this situation, obtain at least one current estimate of the market value. Emily Bouchard, who is with me today, is currently the Interim Chief Appraiser of Canada following the departure of the previous Chief Appraiser. She has been the Assistant Chief Appraiser since 2017. I am also accompanied by my colleague, Linda Jenklin. The role of the Chief Appraiser of Canada in any transaction is limited to providing an independent and impartial appraisal supported by market evidence to assist in making informed real estate decisions. As such, the CAC monitors the quality of third-party appraisal reports, ensuring adherence with standards and best practices. Still, according to the same Treasury Board directive, they have to segregate transaction and valuation responsibilities related to real property transactions. The separation of valuation and transaction responsibilities means that the individuals or entities that provide an opinion on the market value of a property are different from those that handle the sale or purchase of the property. The separation ensures that the valuation is impartial and reliable, while transactions are conducted with dedicated negotiators. This ensures integrity and transparency in the transactional process while minimizing the risk of conflict of interest.
In question today, where the value was above the $500,000 threshold, it was a mandatory requirement for Global Affairs Canada to commission an appraisal report from the Chief Appraiser of Canada via PSPC Appraisal and Valuation Services. PSPC's role in the purchase of the Consul General's residence, therefore, was limited to providing appraisal services. PSPC provided these appraisal services through a third party, John C. Monaco, National Valuation Consultants, and was not involved in the cost-benefit discussions regarding the replacement of the previous residence. The Chief Appraiser of Canada's role is not to confirm the merit of a transaction, nor is it to reinforce the fact that a custodian department has made a good decision by achieving a given real estate transaction. The role is simply to provide an independent appraisal on the value of a property. The segregation between the appraisal responsibilities and the transaction responsibilities, which rests with, in this case, Global Affairs Canada, is highly important and allows for an impartial step in the overall transaction process. Merci. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. We'll start with 6 minutes with Mr. Barrett, please.
So we're asking you these questions today in the context that we live in Canada. That's with housing prices having doubled, rent having doubled, and we have 1 in 4 Canadians saying that they're going to be relying on food banks this fall. And at the same time, we have the Prime Minister's media buddy who gets a well-paid government appointment in New York City, and the existing multi-million-dollar condo is deemed not good enough, and a $9 million luxury condo is purchased for his exclusive use. I'll start with you, Ms. Tattersall. Who signed off on the decision?
So as I said in my opening remarks, the decision was taken under the authority of global affairs. So who signed off would have followed the delegation instrument within global affairs.
Okay, so from your department, who was the most senior person who touched the file?
So nobody touched the file at Treasury Board Secretariat because the transaction fell within the limits
Of $10 million.
of $10 million. So
Okay.
the decision was at global affairs.
Mr. Quinlan, you're an assistant deputy minister. Who was the most senior person in your department who signed off or touched this file?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The chief appraiser in this case, Madame Bouchard, who's accompanying me today, was the most senior person who dealt with this file.
Okay, so we have a 3,600 square foot, 3-bedroom plus studio, 4.5 baths, with a pool, his and her salons, paddle court, golf simulator. Was this purchase, in the context that I mentioned about the cost of living crisis that Canadians are facing, was this flagged for the minister? Madame Bouchard, as the most senior person in your department who touched the file, this excessive, this opulent purchase, was this not something that merited the awareness of the minister?
Merci pour votre question.
Thank you for that question. The Chief Appraiser of Canada does not have the mandate to evaluate the merits of a given transaction or the decision to acquire or dispose of a property. My mandate is simply to take a given address and ensure that it is appraised.
For deciding the value that Canadians get for the purchase, you decide the value of the asset. Who is responsible? And I'm not sure if Treasury Board or if one of you folks would like to respond, but who ultimately is responsible for the value that workers in Western Canada, workers in the prairies, workers in Ontario, Quebec, the Atlantic provinces, what value do they get for this $9 million luxury suite for Justin Trudeau's buddy? Where's the value for Canadian taxpayers here? He was living in a house paid for by the taxpayers.
So if it's helpful to the committee in the examination, I can talk through the principle of best value that sits within the Treasury Board policy.
Okay, so when we're talking about best value, I'm not looking for chapter and verse on what the policy says. What I'm looking for is the practical application of that. So it falls below a threshold of $10 million and therefore doesn't, trigger the need for Treasury Board review, which I think is that's wild, in this respect, multi-million-dollar estates not triggering the review of Treasury Board. We've seen at this committee before and others where Liberal members have said that, well, these decisions are all left to bureaucrats. There's absolutely no ministers who are responsible for any of the tens of millions of dollars that get spent. So this is a condo on Billionaires Row in Manhattan. We have government facilities available to the appointee to host meetings that aren't next to his bedroom. So what is the value that Canadians get for this $9 million purchase in Manhattan?
So if it's helpful, I can explain that you only hold real property to serve a program purpose. So there's two aspects, I think, to the questions that you may have. One, which is, what are the programmatic mission requirements that would drive the decision to have an official residence in a specific area? Those are driven by global affairs, and I think in the submission to the committee, they reference their policy that drives those requirements. So real property exists for requirements, and then when they go to acquire, what I would expect to see and what I think this committee would want to hear from global affairs about is, did they undertake a cost, like a full life cycle cost analysis of the different options? Did they look at keeping it and making the upgrades? Did they look at what the cost, the full cost, would be of acquiring something new, either through a purchase or through a lease? And what was the results of that analysis, and did it show the value? So that's sort of what the Treasury Board policy sets out, and there's two aspects to that.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks very much, Mr. Barrett. Mr. Jory, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and once again, welcome to all the officials back to OGGO. I'm going to start with Madam Tattersall. Actually, the line that you were going is very welcome in the line of questioning that I want to ask. You talked about the program needs, which basically is based on what you've said is determined by GAC. And that is outlined in the document that the GAC has provided. You also talked about the fact that TBS lays out a set of requirements, and they review from a completeness point of view rather than a comprehensive and quality point of view. So they look at it and say, was there a cost-benefit analysis? Did the cost-benefit, was there independent appraisal done, and did the value of the new acquisition outweigh the value of the lease or alternative? So in your opening remark, you also talked about the directive on the management of real property. You touched on a couple of the key points under the, I believe it's the section 4.2.23 to 4.2.27, which is validating the need for acquiring the real estate property based on the program needs and on the real property portfolio strategy. So can you, in very brief, do you believe the procedures that's highlighted by TBS on the directive on the management of real property from subsection section 4.223 to 4.227, all of those were met?
So thank you for the question. I have to start with the premise that this transaction was not reviewed by Treasury Board. So I can't confirm what GAC did on this transaction. I know officials are here tomorrow and they can confirm that. What I can say is I understand that they undertook a financial analysis of the life cycle costs. I think that's something that this committee may want to ask GAC officials tomorrow. And what I can say is what would be maybe helpful for this committee in talking with GAC officials is to understand what due diligence they undertook. We know they undertook an appraisal. I understand they've undertaken a financial analysis. They should set out any other additional due diligence. I believe, and I'm reading the information they submitted to this committee, that in terms of the open aspect of the requirements, that they engaged a broker to look at a list of properties. So there are things that I understand from the submission to the committee that they've undertaken, but I can't confirm. I think that's something that GAC officials will have to confirm to this committee when they appear.
So once the policies are set, and I've highlighted the policy, you pointed to some of those, because the threshold is there and it was below $10 million, there was no need. Am I right to understand that there was no need for the review?
So that's correct. So the transaction limits, and so GAC has had special transaction limits since 1993, which get updated with inflation and market valuation adjustments. But within their authority, they have full authority to transact. But as I said in my opening remarks, it should still be consistent with the Treasury Board policy.
So Treasury Board sets up the policy, but because it fell under the $10 million threshold, there was no need perceived to just even from a completeness. Did you have this? Did you have this? Did you have this? Because it's not needed as per the policy. Does that?
So two things. One, there are hundreds of real property transactions that may occur in any given year. And so that limit is delegated to the department. So they have the responsibility and accountability for that transaction. And so within their governance and oversight, the expectation would be that when they undertook the transaction, that they ensured that their real property management framework, set out all the right decision points and set out the right sort of approaches and steps to ensure consistency with the policy.
Is GAC the only department that has threshold?
No, GAC is one of 8 departments that have special limits. So every department has general real property limits, and 7 other have special limits, and that takes into account sort of their specific operational needs in real property. So they're not the only ones.
Has there been transaction in the past that you may be aware of that fell under the threshold, and they basically said, well, we're gonna conduct a transaction. We don't have to specifically report to TBS, or TBS said it fell under the threshold, therefore we're not going to review it?
So there's lots of transactions that will happen across government that take place within departments that fall within their transaction limits.
On average, what's the size of these transactions? Do you have any idea? I know it's under the threshold, so you...
It's a good question. Because it falls under the threshold, I don't have a line of sight into that. I think it would be an interesting question for GAC to understand what their transactions are. I do know, I tried to prepare a bit for this committee, I do know a lot of their transactions will actually be in respect of leases, because they do a lot of real property transactions for staff quarters. But in terms of the amount and for what, the higher dollar ones will typically be related to official residences or chanceries.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ladies, sir, thank you for coming in on this chilly, almost autumnal summer day. Ms. Tattersall, a few minutes ago, you noted that the threshold was established in 1993 and it has been adjusted since then. When was the last adjustment that set the value at $10 million?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for that question. The last time the limit was reviewed was 2022. There was an adjustment setting the value at $10 million for that department. When that was carried out, what was the limit? The previous time the limit was updated was in 2006. No. In 2022, what was it? So that set it to $10 million. Before it was $4 million. That was back in 2006. So there was a number of 40 years, but that's only 16 years. Sorry, 16. Even 1993 is roughly 30 years ago. So what explains that $4 million was raised all the way up till $10 million? Were requests to exceed the authority so frequent that it was determined that the limit was way too low? I'll start in French, but I might move into English later. There was an assessment every 6 years, if I understand correctly.
May 19th, 2026 had not been updated for 16 years. Your math is better than mine. And what GAC did was it did a review of where it holds properties in 23 markets.
Mais je vais reprendre ma question. Est-ce qu'il
I'll follow up on my question. I'll ask it in another way. How many requests were there for spending above the $4 million limit that justified that the limit should be raised till $10 million, 2.5 times its initial value? That's a good question. I would have to come back to you on that one because I don't have those numbers with me. Thank you. Was it common? Well, I'm looking at what was happening in 2007, 2008. There was a $15 million construction in South Korea. A $3.5 million parking lot was built, but of course that was under the $4 million limit at the time. A chancellery was built in Bangladesh, $6 million. Does the value of real estate often go above $5, $6, $7 million? Or is that something exceptional? I'll answer in English.
Quand il y a un projet comme une...
When there is a project, like a construction project, for example, that could require Treasury Board review because that would be a project. During a project, there might be a number of reasons for a review.
Capacity, there's an assessment for that. It could come to Treasury Board. During the last few years, I'm not aware of any major real property transactions that have come to Treasury Board.
OK. Donc, si je comprends bien...
So if I am understanding correctly, in this case, the New York case, you didn't have to grant authority because it was under the $10 million threshold. Does the $10 million threshold include or exclude life cycle costs of the apartment? Or is it just $10 million only for the purchase and that's it? Just for the purchase and that's it. Do you have any sense of the life cycle costs? Was a maintenance plan taken into account? You wouldn't want an apartment to fall into disrepair. That's not something established, but it's a good point. It was just a question. Normally, when you buy a house, you figure out that you're going to have to repair the roof or the windows in 5 years, so I imagine there was some similar planning in this case. I would hope so, at any rate. Maybe this question is more for GAC, but I'll ask you, Ms. Bouchard. GAC sent an appraisal report for the residence on 47th in New York. Wonderful building. I'd actually seen it in real life, not realizing it was this one. The report says an appraisal report was carried out, and in US dollars, the apartment is worth roughly $6 million. So that gives us roughly $9 million in Canadian dollars. Was there an equivalent appraisal report for the Park Avenue residence, which is now up for sale? As part of its procedures, Global Affairs called upon my office to obtain a market value appraisal. One was carried out, I believe, in 2023. I'd need to look into my notes to get the exact month, but I believe it was in June. We carried out an update report this year in June 2024. So we updated the appraisal report. I cannot go into too much detail about the appraisal report, given that the unit is up for sale. We wouldn't want to compromise the smooth functioning of a transaction. So I don't want to go into the report too much, but I can say that a report was requested and updated. Okay, I'll come back to you later. Thank you.
Grack, over to you, please, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and good to see everyone virtually. Good to be back at the committee, and I want to start by thanking our witnesses for helping us understand how these kinds of purchases and sales work and the role of Treasury Board and PSPC in that process. And my colleagues have canvassed a number of aspects of this, and I understand that the extent or the breadth of questioning is somewhat limited given TSB and PSPC's limited roles. I'm curious, though, how far back the basic process, the basic structure for these kinds of transactions. We've talked a little bit about the policies that are in place and the procedures. How far back do those procedures go? And perhaps this is a question for Ms. Tattersall from TSB.
So the current directive has been in effect since 2021, but there was a policy on real property in advance of that. I don't know how far back it goes, but it goes back a far way, so it would have covered transactions for decades now, but the current policy goes back to 2021.
And following on my colleague Ms. Vignola's question about the increase in the threshold that was made in 2022 when it was increased from 4 million to 10 million, I'm wondering what the rationale. I assume that there was a request from Global Affairs to increase the limit. What was the rationale for increasing the limit? Because obviously it comes at the costs of reduced scrutiny, reduced accountability, reduced transparency, all of those things. What was the rationale that was provided for that quite significant increase in the threshold?
So the thresholds have an expiry date. So the last time that the threshold for an acquisition for an official residence had been updated was in 2006, and that's when the 4 million had been set up. There was 16 years in between that. So the business case looked at inflation over the 16 years, the changes in the market conditions, the real property market conditions. And then it may be important to hear from GAC officials as well. But they basically, is my understanding from that increase, they looked at 23 different markets because GAC has missions in, I think, over 100 countries. So they looked at 23 different markets and looked at the average price for an acquisition of an official residence. And it was on that basis that the update to the limit was made. Again, as I previously said, that those limits are looked at on a regular basis, and the next time the scheduled review of those limits is in 2026.
What would the downside or the risks be of leaving the $4 million limit in place to ensure greater scrutiny of these transactions?
So first, I think it's important to note that Global Affairs, even if they're taking the transaction under their own authorities, still has to ensure that they have the proper due diligence, the proper scrutiny, the proper decision making. So I think that's an important first. The next thing would be to understand what their real property holdings are. And so I don't know if I have details on that, but typically I think it's a question for GAC as to how many official residences or chanceries that they own around the world and how that would bump up against the limit. So yeah, the bigger ones, the more complex ones that may have a project element would certainly come into the board if it was over their risk and capacity. But I don't have anything else to answer, to add to that answer.
I understand that Global Affairs is responsible for their own due diligence, and I'm not questioning that process. My understanding is that the reason that Treasury Board gets involved in transactions over the $10 million threshold is to provide an added layer of accountability and due diligence on behalf of the Canadian public. And so I guess, given the challenges that we've seen in procurement government-wide, why, just for the sake of caution, we wouldn't have a lower threshold in order to ensure that there are more eyes on each transaction and that Canadians are getting the best value?
GAC has been managing its real property for decades, and it's had special limits since 1993. I found the number. They have 87 official residences across government. So within that limit, it's a balance between those transactions that GAC routinely will undertake and manage, balanced against those that would be above that limit that really necessitate Treasury Board approval.
Okay. I believe you said the next review of the limits is in 2026. So it was 14 years between reviews and then 4 years between reviews. Is the intention to have, maybe I misunderstood the timeline here. Is the intention to have more frequent reviews of the limits?
So I should clarify, the period of review hasn't changed. It's that the limits were not increased. I think in 2019 there was a review. They were not increased in 2019. There were reviews, so there's regularly scheduled reviews. We don't update them necessarily each time it comes up for a review.
Okay. And this might be a question for
Sorry,
Mr.
that is our time.
There's Mr. Chair.
It's past our time, but lots of opportunity. We are booking tomorrow's meeting, by the way, at committee request at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, just for you, Mr. Bachrach. Mrs. Block, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I just want to continue along the lines of some of my colleagues, but also just to establish an understanding about PSPC's role when it comes to the real property that the Government of Canada holds, as well as the Treasury Board Secretariat's role. So PSPC is the real property manager for the Government of Canada. Is that correct?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. PSPC manages most of the office portfolio for the Government of Canada, roughly a quarter of the real property holdings if you think of square meters of office space or other kinds of special purpose space. And PSPC also manages a large portfolio of engineering assets, infrastructure, things like dams and bridges.
Okay. Does PSPC provide any sort of oversight to the property that we own in other countries?
No, as previously indicated in my opening remarks, PSPC's role following Treasury Board policy, Treasury Board Secretariat policy, is to provide the appraisal services.
Okay, so I'm wondering if both you and Ms. Tattersall would be willing to table your opening remarks to the committee.
Absolutely, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. We used to receive them ahead of a committee meeting and would be happy to have those in writing. So when GAC purchases property, are those properties registered with PSPC? Where are they registered?
Well, with regards to PSPC, we do not have a registry of properties outside of PSPC's portfolio, with some very limited exceptions. So I can turn to Treasury Board to complete that answer.
So GAC would be the custodian for the real property, and you can either acquire it or they could it could be crown leased when they have it.
Okay, so I know that you spoke about the real property holdings of GAC. I would appreciate it if you would table that list that you referenced to the committee.
I think I asked how many. I think GAC officials, I would feel more comfortable if you got it directly from the department and their holdings.
I will do that tomorrow, for sure. So who writes the guidelines for real property purchases on behalf of the Government of Canada?
So we have a Treasury Board policy that sets the framework, and then within that, there's a requirement that in each custodian department, so GAC being a custodian department, has a senior designated official that is appointed responsible for the management of real property within GAC, and they would have a real property management framework that they're responsible for that would set out how things are done within GAC.
So the Treasury Board Secretariat role, and I'm quoting, in procurement includes developing, implementing, monitoring, and renewing procurement-related policies and instruments. That it also evaluates business proposals, monitors bidding processes, and ensures compliance with policies and standards. What we've heard today is that you only do that once a purchase or an acquisition is over $10 million. Is that correct?
So maybe first, when we talk about real property acquisition, it's the directive on the management of real property that applies, not the procurement policy.
Okay.
And so, as I said in my opening remarks, we set the administrative framework, and then if an acquisition or a disposition is over the limits that a department has, it would come to Treasury Board for authority.
Thank you. So where do the departments get the funding for these types of purchases? Is that budgeted for in the annual budget of the Government of Canada?
That's a great question. I'm going to flip to a page. So most custodians will have a capital budget. That is where they get the funding for investments in real property. So, for example, GAC's Vote 5 capital budget, for 2024-25 is $192 million. So they have a capital budget that is responsible for those expenditures, which is then voted on through the estimates process.
So they have this pool of money that's provided to them in the budget, and then through the estimates process, do they provide a vote highlighting what they are actually spending this money on?
So it would be considered sort of A-based funding. So they have so many real property assets that they have A-based funding to help manage all of those assets. And that's in their Vote 5, and that would be in their estimates.
So because
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ms. Atwin, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you everyone for joining us today and our witnesses. I'm joining from beautiful Fredericton, New Brunswick. Our average home price here is about $297,000. So I want to help, Canadians understand this. I want to understand this as a member of Parliament as well. So maybe if we can just start at the beginning, and perhaps Mr. Quinlan, if you could, perhaps this is for GAC officials more so, but what is this residence used for? Mr. Barrett suggested that it's for the, sole use, exclusive use of our one representative, but what is this residence actually used for?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would agree with the premise and the question that this would be a question for GAC officials, and PSPC would not be the appropriate department to answer.
Okay. Ms. Tattersall, would you like to add anything there?
No, I think GAC sets out the mission requirements for that official residence. They'd be best positioned to respond.
And I understand the previous property was estimated value of $13 million. Is that correct?
Could be confirmed through Chief Appraiser, Interim Chief Appraiser, Madame Bouchard, but that is also my understanding. Madame Bouchard?
Oui, merci. En fait,
Thank you. The $14 million you saw was the current asking price for the previous residence.
So can perhaps Madame Bouchard or anyone, could you speak to the key differences between this residence versus the previous one that we've now offloaded to purchase this new one?
donc, oui, je peux vous en parler brièvement.
I can speak to that briefly. The goal of today's discussion was to talk about the transaction for 111 West 57th Street. The information I have on the other report is limited. Also, given that the residence is currently up for sale, I need to limit the information that I can provide on its appraisal. What I can say is that the unit currently up for sale was larger when compared to the one we are studying today. The Park Avenue residence had a better view than the recently acquired property. It's located on the 12th floor of a 17-story building in a residential neighborhood in the Upper East Side neighborhood, which is mostly residential. And considered quite desirable to live in. Meanwhile, the property acquired on West 57th Street is in a building that, a heritage building with an annex built on. The unit in question is on the 11th floor in the annex, the first residential story of the building. Everything below that is non-residential. Annexed onto it is the famous skyscraper that can be seen as part of the New York skyline. I would say, overall, the location of the unit within the building is different, as well as the location of the building within the city of New York, and the size and view of the unit. Those would be the differences between the two units. Thank you very much.
I'm hearing a lot about location, and certainly, more of an ideal place perhaps for some of the work that is done and conducted in that residence. I come to understand there was also some issues with code. Can anyone speak to the previous residence not being up to code or up to perhaps accessibility standards? Is this one of the, parts of the conversation would have gone into this new acquisition was around accessibility or meeting codes, or, can you speak to why we have this new residence?
I would start perhaps by, again, indicating that these decisions were decisions made by Global Affairs Canada, and PSPC provided the appraisal services, but the decision really belongs to Global Affairs Canada.
Great. Well, I very much look forward to asking them these same questions tomorrow as well. So I certainly appreciate your best attempts at explaining some of the thoughts that I think are going through many of our minds right now. And just in general, as my time kind of runs down, have you personally dealt with any similar cases like this where residence or real property was bought to replace one that was being sold?
What I can speak to in the context of PSPC's responsibilities, notably for the office portfolio, is that we regularly look at our assets that we own and assets that we lease, and make a number of decisions in order to right-size the Government of Canada's office portfolio. And in fact, following the last budget, we are following government direction to significantly reduce that office portfolio over the next 10 years, and that will require us to dispose of a number of properties that we currently have and acquire new leases in certain cases, and the properties that we will dispose of, many of them, again, following government direction, will be put to contribute to be converted into housing. So decisions are made in that regard, and I can speak to the responsibilities for PSPC. But going back to this particular transaction, Global Affairs Canada would be well suited to answer your questions.
Thanks, Ms. Atwin. Ms. Vignola, please, for 2.5.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Bouchard, I understand that the appraisal of the Park Avenue residence is not available because we certainly don't want to lose our negotiating position in the sales process. That being said, would we be able to review it under embargo? Or without the ability to share the document? I would not be able to answer that. I'm unable to say whether there are certain conditions in which the appraisal could be shared. Chair? I would need you to weigh in on this. Would it be possible, in your view, to request the appraisal for the Park Avenue residence so that we could review it under embargo?
Committee agrees to view it confidentially. So done.
Merci.
We'll set a date. By next week, perhaps? Would it be, Ms. Bouchard, have you seen that appraisal? Is it in English and French already?
J'ai vu le rapport.
Yes, I saw the appraisal.
Already?
Le rapport, non, il est seulement.
The report? No, it's solely in English.
Just on this issue?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're just going to suspend for a couple seconds for the Liberals for this. But the idea is to have it in confidence.
I just want to make sure that.
We'll suspend for 2 minutes.
Yeah. What are the requirements? I mean.
Okay, with you, I'll ask you to withdraw, and we'll reconsider it after perhaps your next round. Mr. Jarry is suggesting we all talk offline at the break about it. Perfect. Continue. You have about 2 minutes.
Merci. Rapidement,
Thank you. Very quickly, Ms. Tattersall. Does the Treasury Board carry out assessments of monthly costs of an apartment, or do you only look at purchase prices over a certain limit? Is there also a limit for monthly costs? There's an annual and total limit. In total for every apartment, or for each one, for example? And what is the annual limit?
J'ai l'information pour.
I've got the info for Global Affairs. For GAC, I'm going to give it to you in English.
Purchases, limits, it's all available online. So
Okay.
after this, I'm happy to send to the clerk also
S'il
the
vous plaît.
link to all the transactions, and it'll
Merci.
be there for GAC and everybody, if that's more
Oui.
helpful than me
Oui.
saying it all out.
Merci.
Okay.
Oui, vous pouvez me l'envoyer, il n'y a pas de problème.
Yes, you can send that my way, no problem there. Generally, in Canada, there's a policy for purchases by PSPC and other departments of a call for offers. The current purchase on West 57th Street is part of the 5 least expensive units viewed. Why did the government not go with the cheapest unit?
Mark and I know each other well, so we're always butting into each other. Il y a ce concept de l'optimisation des ressources.
There is the concept of best value. But this is an investment as well. There is a balance between costs and program objectives and government priorities.
An apartment that's more expensive but is accessible, supports the greening government objectives, may be best value. So low cost, the lowest cost is not always the best value.
Thank you very much. Mr. Backrack, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just as a question to you, Mr. Chair, are we doing 2 6-minute rounds here?
This is just, the opening is 6 minutes, and then 5-5, 2.5, 2.5, 5-5, repeating
Okay,
through.
I'm just confused because Ms. Vignola's round, she just had 2 6-minute slots, I believe. So I'm just
Oh,
looking to you in terms of.
No, her actual in questioning time was about 2.5, 3 minutes. We're letting everything run a tiny bit. Yours ran a bit late as well. But it was probably 6 minutes because of the suspension. It was probably a bit long because of the suspension. I'll restart your time. Go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. My first question of this round is for Mr. Quinlan, and I know in the wake of the ArriveCan scandal, PSPC has committed to a number of procurement reforms. I'm curious whether those reforms will affect the real property procurement process, and if so, how?
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Donc, je suis le sous-ministre.
Thank you. So I am the Senior ADM for Real Property Services within Public Services and Procurement Canada. We have a number of collaborations with our procurement colleagues. I would be happy to provide you after the meeting with a more detailed response on the application of measures to improve real estate management.
So just to be clear, Mr. Quinlan, that's a yes, those reforms will affect real property procurement. However, a more detailed response would be required.
Donc, encore une fois,
Again, Chair, here we're referring to certain reforms in procurement. Given that I'm the Senior ADM for Real Property Services, and given that there is a collaboration between Real Property Services and Procurement Services, I commit to providing the committee with a list of reforms that could potentially impact real property. But I would like to assure the Chair that real property will not be unduly affected by the reforms under discussion. In the context of real property, there are procurement processes, and the reforms to procurement could potentially affect real property. And via you, Chair, it would be my pleasure to provide a detailed response for use by the committee in writing.
I think that would be of interest to the committee. So if you don't mind, Mr. Quinlan, providing that response, that would be much appreciated.
Great, thanks. And we do have, we've passed a motion that all responses are required within 21 days. So if you could do that. Next up, we have Mr. Brock. Go ahead, please.
Thanks, Chair. Before I get into my substantive questions, I'm just curious, in relation to another Justin Trudeau scandal, the Arrive scam, it was revealed that prior to a first committee attendance, the president of the CBSA, the deputy minister, was summoned to the Prime Minister's office, presumably for coaching. Have either of you, and Mr. Quinlan on screen, has anyone received coaching prior to your appearance today? Was anyone?
Correct.
No? Mr. Quinlan?
No, just answering, Mr. Chair, sorry, just to answer the question directly, the answer is no.
Thank you. No one was required to attend the Prime Minister's office? No? Mr. Quinlan?
The answer is no, Mr. Chair.
Did anyone get direction from the minister, in your case, Minister Duclos?
No direction, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Now, I know there is a lot that has been written in our nationals with respect to the extravagant nature of this acquisition. There was a quote from Global Affairs, I appreciate, not attributable to anyone here, but I wish to read it out to the record. The residence currently used for the head of mission and consul general in New York, this is the Park Avenue property, was purchased in '61, last refurbished in '82. The apartment does not meet new building codes nor Global Affairs standards. Now, the purchase at West 57th is listed as follows. There is an elegant entry foyer with white Makuba stone floors. Is that a requirement for the Council General of Canada?
Perhaps in answering that question, I've sort of alluded to it before. You only hold real property to support.
Ma'am, that's not my question.
Right.
Is it a requirement of Mr. Clark's position as Council General in New York that he has white Makuba stone floors? Is that a requirement?
That's not.
I'm just curious.
It's not a Treasury Board requirement.
Okay. A stunning powder room finished in jewel onyx. Another requirement of Council General?
Of the Treasury Board Secretariat, that would not be a requirement in our policy.
Custom smoke gray oak floors in a parquet pattern. Would that be a requirement of Mr. Clark?
So I think all my answers to your questions will be yeah.
Yeah. The condo includes 3 bedrooms, a study, 4.5 bedrooms, including one, this is the master bathroom, clad in Italian white Venato marble, and featuring a freestanding copper soaking tub handcrafted by William Holland and custom bronze fixtures by P.E. Guerin. Now, again, I'll ask the same question that you can't answer, whether or not that's Mr. Clark's requirements or Council General's requirements. But you talk about this being an investment. Low cost is not always the best value. There are starving Canadians who are relying on food banks who would love to have a real property investment in New York with these type of features. Do you see the disconnect between what the government is doing and the reality on the Canadian streets? You see that distinction?
So I totally appreciate your comments. And
I go further. The amenities include a 25-meter 2-lane swimming pool with private cabanas, a separate sauna and treatment rooms, a fitness center, a residence lounge, and access to a paddle court, a golf simulator. I'd love to have a golf simulator sitting in my basement, but I'm not Justin Trudeau's friends. So friends of Justin Trudeau get to explore these wonderful, wealthy amenities while the rest of us Canadians have to struggle. Do you see the problem that the Government of Canada has with respect to this purchase? The optics are very, very poor. And I know you talk about a threshold of up to $10 million, but you didn't have to buy right at the foot of Central Park. Manhattan is a big island. Why does the Council General require that proximity to Central Park? Why does he have to have all of these luxury amenities while the rest of us suffer in this country? Why?
So I think a good response to get to response to your question, and I think it's alluded to in the package that was submitted to this committee, is the mission requirements are established by Global Affairs under their property management manual. So I think when Global Affairs officials are here, they should be able to walk through
Those discussions.
how they set out those requirements for an official residence.
Canadians deserve an answer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Baines, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. My question are directed, my initial questions here are directed to members of the PSPC. If you could help me understand a little bit more. The Treasury Board's transaction approval limits and conditions for the acquisition or disposition of real property says GAC may dispose of properties outside Canada up to a transaction limit of $25 million. Is PSPC required to appraise properties that are being disposed under the transaction limit?
So PSPC is responsible for providing the appraisal for the acquisition and the disposal. For more questions with regards to the actual policy, I defer to my colleague from Treasury Board Secretariat.
So PSPC is required to appraise properties that are being disposed under the transaction limit, right?
Okay. Yes, PSPC follows Treasury Board Secretary's policy, and when disposal services are required, we provide those to custodians, in this case, Global Affairs Canada.
So in the event that the previous property is being disposed of, you would be required to appraise that, provide appraisal for that.
Following Treasury Board Secretariat policy, that's correct.
And when other departments purchase properties, again, PSPC is involved in the cost-benefit analysis also?
Strictly following Treasury Board Secretariat's policy with regards to the appraisal. And again, strictly limited to the appraisal.
Okay,
and the business decisions, I apologize, Mr. Chair. I interrupted the member, so I will stop my answer. Wait for the next question.
No, you can continue. You were about to finish your statement.
Yes, so the business decisions belong to the custodial departments.
Okay, and then the directive on the management of real property states that departments must undertake a full life cycle analysis, again, before acquiring a real property asset, seeking the best value. And given that the property purchase cost $9 million and the old residence is being sold for over $13 million, would you say that it appears as good value that's being attained?
I believe that the specific question, Mr. Chair, should be addressed to Global Affairs Canada. With the question, the part of the question that pertains to the policy, I will defer to my colleague from Treasury Board Secretariat.
So, in response to the question, the expectation would be that Global Affairs took a life cycle cost analysis of maintaining the existing and updating it, acquiring the new one through either a lease or through a purchase. As part of that life cycle analysis, they would be looking at not just the cost of acquisition, but the ongoing operating costs and the potential disposition costs. So the expectation would be that GAC in its options analysis looked at that, and that helped inform the decision that they took.
So, in essence, all levels of government buy and sell properties. This is something that is done, and there's a level of maintenance that's required. We see, properties that may need to be up to standard, up to code. Like, what are some of those requirements? Maybe, accessibility. Were there issues in this case with respect? I understand there was some discussion around the previous residents being not up to code. If you can maybe talk a little bit about that, the standards and the code of what's required in the properties that are being purchased. What do they need? What things should they have? Whether it's accessibility to people with disabilities or things of that nature.
I'll start the answer to that question. So, consistent with Treasury Board policy, you would want to make sure that you, acquire and hold and maintain real property only to support a programmatic need of a department. So the requirements around the need for an official residence and what those specifications look like would be set by Global Affairs. They have that authority pursuant to the departmental legislation, so that's the first. And then there are requirements around ensuring that the real property supports broader government priorities. That would include greening, that would include accessibility. So those factors should come into play in that business case that Global Affairs would have undertaken to support the transaction.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, that is past our time, Mr. Baines. We'll now go to Mr. Genuis. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Chair. My key initial question here is the why. Because all in a fairly short space of time, in about a 2-year period, the Government of Canada made 3 distinct moves. First, they raised the limit on the value of property that one department could purchase on their own authority. They raised it from $4 million to $10 million. That reduced accountability and oversight. Then they appointed Tom Clark, appointed by the Prime Minister to be the Consul General in New York. And then immediately with this new hyper well-connected person in as Consul General, it became a Government of Canada priority to purchase a new residence. So you have these three things happening in close succession. And it seems to me that the timing is highly suspicious. There was no indication prior to Mr. Tom Clark getting this appointment that there was a lot of discussion around a need for a new residence, and yet immediately he takes this position, and all of a sudden, Global Affairs is talking about the need for a brand new, what turned out to be luxury residence for the brand new, politically well-connected Consul General. So to the officials. Do you know, or at least officially, who it was that started the conversation about the alleged need for a new residence? Who was it that said, "Hey, we should get a new residence in New York"?
So I'll answer for Treasury Board Secretariat. Those decisions occurred under GAC's authority, so we don't have a line of sight as to what precipitated the purchase. The only information I can refer to is what was provided to this committee, which they talked about.
But it was initiated within the department.
Correct.
It wasn't the PSBC or Treasury Board or any other department saying, hey, by the way, looks like we might need this. It was Tom Clark, new Consul General, comes in close to the Prime Minister, and then Global Affairs is on their own authority initiating this conversation about a new residence.
So I would answer that any decisions on this matter would have occurred within Global Affairs.
Okay. For the Chief Appraiser, I want to clarify on the asking price versus the appraised value of the previous property. It was implied by some of my Liberal colleagues that the appraised value was the same as the asking price. Could you just very clearly clarify, is the asking price the same as the appraised value of the property?
Merci pour la question. En fait,
Thank you for that question. The property, as described in the appraisal report, had been on the market for a number of months. The price had been adjusted a few times.
Yes, it's a simple question. I'm talking about the previous property, not the newly acquired property, the previous property.
Okay.
Is the asking price the same as the appraised value, or are they different?
Comme j'ai précisé tout à l'heure.
As I noted earlier, I cannot go into details about the first appraisal report produced on that property, because the property...
That's all I'm looking for, just the clarification. So anyone who's making public comments about what the value of that property is, politicians or otherwise, isn't doing so on any factual basis. The previous property has not sold yet, correct?
À ma connaissance, elle est toujours à vendre.
To my knowledge, it is still up for sale.
Okay, all right. So there is a lot of misinformation being pushed on this, particularly by supporters of the government. Based on our own research, we've seen that properties in the same building have sold substantially under asking price, or have even been taken off the market once put on. So I think that's important for the committee to note. Who decided on the asking price? Was that you? Was that within Global Affairs? Who decided the asking price for that previous property?
Comme il a été mentionné.
As noted in Mr. Quinlan's opening remarks, one of the foundations of the process and the...
J'y arrive.
I'm getting there. I can say that the decision was not made by the chief appraiser. Our job is to provide an appraisal for a given...
La décision de fixer le...
The decision to set the asking price, is that what you're asking?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Dans ce cas précis...
In this precise case, I would suggest that you ask that question to Global Affairs Canada.
Okay, so this is the problem, right? The government wants to trumpet the asking price as if it means something, but you're the appraiser who appraised it, and that's completely separate. We don't even know who set in the asking price. Sorry, Chair. I'm done.
Yeah, we are out of time. Although, Ms. Bouchard, a very clear question was asked to you. If you do not know who set the price, please just say, I do not know. But if you do know who set the price, as Mr. Genuis was asking, I would ask you to present that answer to us.
Je ne sais pas qui a fixé le prix.
I do not know who set the asking price, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Van Bynen, welcome to OGGO. You've got 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As a 30-year banker, I think what's important throughout all of this is to ensure that the taxpayers have received a real value in the transaction. So my first question then is to Mr. Quinlan. Can you explain the role of the chief appraiser plays in the Treasury Board's Secretariat's directive on the management of real property?
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Donc,
Yes, thank you, Chair. In the context of the transaction in question, given that the value is above $500,000, the Treasury Board directive states that custodian departments are required to seek an appraisal. It is in that context that our department played our role.
Thank you. And in this situation, how was the third-party appraiser chosen, and what are the prerequisite needs to be met in order for an approved third-party appraiser to act on behalf of the Government of Canada?
Oui, merci beaucoup pour la question, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you for that question, Chair. I will ask my colleague, Ms. Bouchard, to follow up on my answer. But I would say that appraisers must be certified in the jurisdiction in question. My understanding is that we reached out to a renowned firm rather. I will let my colleague complete my response.
Merci, Monsieur Quinlan.
Thank you, Mr. Quinlan. Yes, indeed. The firm that was brought in to carry out an appraisal report was NVC, National Valuation Consultants. It's an established American appraisal firm with a number of regional offices. My office has worked with this firm in the past. In this exact case, we selected that firm to carry out an appraisal.
Thank you. Can you tell me what the factors are during the appraisal process? Are they standard for each appraisal, or are they dependent on each individual property?
En fait, on va sélectionner.
What we do is we select appraisal firms based on the nature of the mandate entrusted with us. Also based on the nature of the property being valued and the goal of the appraisal. All of this will feed into the choice of which appraiser or which firm to bring in. They are brought in based on the nature of the exact file in question. In this case, the property being evaluated.
Thank you. And then, as the real estate broker for the federal government, Public Services and Procurement Canada is responsible for the development and the management of these appraisal standards. As we're discussing an international property, do you know if any other countries have policies in line with PSPC's valuation guidelines? And are there any other countries that we could look to possibly improve our current policy?
C'est une excellente question. Et,
That's an excellent question. We are certainly always looking for ways to improve how we do things. Our practices closely resemble those seen in other Commonwealth countries. We resemble the United States, the UK, Australia. Our practices are largely in line with what we observe in other countries.
Thank you. And when other departments purchase properties, is PSPC involved in the cost-benefit analysis? It's a question we've heard all too often today.
To answer that question, again, referring to my colleague at Treasury Board Secretariat, but PSPC is not responsible for those decisions. PSPC's responsibility is very targeted, very limited to the services Madam Shaw provides in the context of applying the Treasury Board Secretariat's policy.
Okay, then coming back to the directive on management of real...
Sorry, Mr. Van Bynen, that is our 5 minutes, I'm afraid. And we are going to, colleagues, we're going to break for 10 minutes right now. We'll come back with Mrs. Vignola and perhaps a solution to her earlier request. Thank you for your patience. We'll go right to Ms. Vignola for 5 minutes, and then we'll go over to Mr. Bachrach for 5 minutes. Go ahead, Mrs. Vignola.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Ms. Tattersall, in any discussion about renovating an apartment or property, it is necessary to, well, I imagine that throughout the world, Canada owns about several hundred properties, and in any discussion about renovations, are there cost limits above which authority must be sought? I'm going to answer in English.
No, transactions are only related to acquisition and disposition. However, if there was a major renovation project and the project exceeded their capacity, it could come to the board. So it's a different, in project management, it's not a dollar limit. It's based on an assessment of the department's risk and capacity, and then the risk and capacity of the project.
OK. Est-ce qu'il y a, à votre connaissance...
To your knowledge, and perhaps Global Affairs would be a better place to answer this, but perhaps Mr. Quinlan has the answer as well, so I will give him the opportunity to respond. To your knowledge, are there any difficulties associated with trade agreements like that we have with the United States, which would have an impact on the cost of renovations for residences in New York or, for example, Washington? Under our diplomatic trade agreements with the United States, do we have any obligations that would drive up renovation costs? As you noted, I think this question would be better to ask to Global Affairs. Mr. Quinlan, if I understood correctly earlier, and I would appreciate a yes or no answer, PSPC is in charge of the government's real property in Canada, but not real property abroad. Mr. Chair, I would like to provide a short answer. Unfortunately, the question requires a more fulsome answer. I will still endeavor to be brief. PSPC is in charge of roughly 25% of the built space held by the government in Canada. There are other custodian departments that own properties, for example, Correctional Services Canada and the Department of National Defence. PSPC is mostly in charge of office space, as well as certain infrastructure facilities like bridges and dams. But you're only responsible for property within Canada, not abroad? Exactly, Mr. Chair.
Merci.
Thank you. Regarding properties outside of Canada, would those be held by Global Affairs solely, or are there other departments holding property abroad? There are 28 custodian departments throughout the government.
But Global Affairs also plays a common service provider role to other departments that have a presence internationally.
OK. Merci beaucoup. Et lorsque vient...
Thank you. When it is time to manage renovations of the real estate portfolio abroad, are renovations carried under the responsibility of one department, or does every custodian department look after the maintenance, renovation, and sale of their own portfolio? Every custodian department is in charge of their own portfolio. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. Mr. Bachrach, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll start. Let me just remove the pin here. There we go. I'll start with a question for Ms. Bouchard. It was mentioned earlier that these properties aren't only, they're not only expenditures, they're also investments. And I'm wondering if you can speak to the real estate trends in the area in which Global Affairs has purchased this apartment. What we're seeing in Manhattan and specifically the neighborhood where this apartment is located, Billionaires Row, the vacancy rate in the building versus vacancy rates in the nearby area. Are those things that you would have looked at as part of the appraisal? And can you provide a bit of context in terms of the value of this particular apartment now and in the future?
Donc, merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. I don't know if you have had the opportunity to read the appraisal report. I understand that it's quite long, but it contains a great deal of information. Of course, the Chief Appraiser of Canada cannot be an expert in the real estate trends all around the world. This is why we bring in local independent expertise to help us understand the value of an asset that requires an appraisal. The data that I have on Manhattan, and specifically the neighborhood where the unit in question is located, can be found in the appraisal report. I have not sought out a second opinion on the real estate trends in that market. My understanding, based on the market analysis carried out by the independent evaluator that we brought in, well, it goes from the general to the particular. First, there's an analysis of real estate in New York State, then in New York City, then in each of the 5 boroughs. So we focus then on Manhattan, and within Manhattan on 2 neighborhoods, Central Park South Residential, so the neighborhood bordering Central Park to the south, where the unit under question is located, and an analysis of the Central Midtown neighborhood, because certain comparable units were sold in that neighborhood. Like you, I was able to read the analysis carried out by the independent evaluator. There we see that sources of information were used, which are commonly used when compiling such statistics. There was a socioeconomic analysis carried out on the occupants of these neighborhoods, we also look at the volume and scale of transactions carried out, which we discount to present value. We look at recent years and we carry out projections for future years. What we see is that the market seems to be behaving differently for condos versus co-ops. As such, analyses were carried out for each of these segments of the market individually. You can see certain similarities to Canadian real estate trends. We are subjected to the same socioeconomic phenomena as those seen in the United States. In Manhattan and in the neighborhood, there's not set to be a major increase in population, maybe something minor over the next 5 years. Also in the report, well, I don't believe we have anything on vacancy rates.
OK, désolé.
Sorry, I'll stop there. That's the info I have on the market. It's the same information as you have in the appraisal report.
Thanks. Mrs. Block.
Thank you, Chair. I have 5 minutes. I'll keep my questions pretty tight because I do want to share my time with my colleague, Mr. Genuis. Prior to 2019, how many purchases over $4 million were referred to Treasury Board Secretariat by Global Affairs Canada?
A follow-up question in writing.
Okay, you'll provide that to us?
Yep.
Thank you very much. Between 2019 and 2022, how many requests were received by Global Affairs Canada to Treasury Board Secretariat over $4 million before the policy changed?
So any sort of how many transactions exceeded their limits, I'd have to come back with an answer.
So in essence, a policy was changed in 2022, but you don't have the numbers to give us to demonstrate perhaps why the limit had to increase from 4 million to 10 million.
So two separate things. The transaction limits are reviewed on a regular basis.
Right.
And then the policy was updated. Those two weren't tied. You're asking for specific how many transactions exceeded those limits. I don't have that information with me here today.
So you're saying the raise in the limit was not tied to the number of requests TBS would have been receiving over that $4 million threshold?
So the business case would have been related to not just the transactions, but also a market analysis, a look at the increased inflation. It also was substantiated by a review by Global Affairs of 23 markets and what the average price of acquisition was for it.
Okay, thank you for that. Many times you've indicated that TBS did not or does not have eyes on the real property purchases under the threshold of 10 million, and that Global Affairs actually has to be able to demonstrate due diligence in following the framework that has been given to them for the purchasing of real property. Who do they demonstrate that due diligence to?
So within a department, accountability rests at the deputy head. And
at
then
the deputy minister level?
So the deputy head, yep. And the deputy head under the current policy will appoint a senior designated official responsible for real property. And they will set out their real property management framework. So when GAC is here, they could outline what their framework is and their delegations and their governance.
But they basically demonstrate due diligence to themselves. Nobody else has any role to play in actually assuring that Global Affairs Canada is following due diligence.
So part of the external element is the appraisal that is provided by an external party.
Thank you. I'll turn my time over.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of cost to taxpayers, it's important to underline that we haven't sold one residence and purchased another. We currently have 2 Consul General's residences in New York, each of which have very substantial carrying costs. Tom Clark was apparently so keen on a new luxury condo that they bought that condo before even listing the existing property, with no guarantee that it would sell at an acceptable price. In general, as it relates to the Treasury Board policy, would you say it's a best practice to secure a buyer for the first property before purchasing the second?
So our policy doesn't speak to sequencing. Our policy speaks to making decisions based on the full life cycle costs. So the sequencing and how that is determined would be set out within the department.
Okay, do you think it's common sense that we don't need 2 Consul General's residences in New York, and that you need to make sure that you're going to be able to sell the first at an acceptable price before you purchase the second, and also that you don't want to be responsible for very significant carrying costs for 2 properties on an ongoing basis? Would that seem to you like common sense?
I would say from how I'm managing my real property portfolio, I would want to understand their sequencing that they've taken and if they've included those costs into their life cycle cost analysis.
Right, but just from a common sense perspective, though, I mean, most people that are pinching their pennies, we're going through a cost of living crisis. Many Canadians can't afford homes at all, but most people don't go out and purchase the second home before they've begun the process of selling their first home because they don't want to be on the hook for the costs associated with owning 2 homes at once over a long period of time. And again, this first property wasn't even listed until last week, essentially immediately before these committees were starting. Shouldn't the government of Canada apply these common sense, real world insights to their decisions around real property?
I think I would want to understand from GAC officials when they started the process to ready the property for disposition and how that figured into their strategy around the replacement of the official residence.
Thank you very much. All the way from sunny Windsor, Mr. Kuzmierczuk.
Thank you very much for that enthusiastic introduction, Mr. Chair, and very accurate. 99.99% of the questions that I have are actually directed towards GAC, because GAC holds pretty much all the cards and all the answers to the questions that we have here. But I do have some questions to pose. I wanted just to begin by setting a little bit of background here. As I understand it, Government of Canada manages 6.9 million square meters of real property, so about 7 million meters of real property. Is that am I in the ballpark here?
Mr. Chair, I can answer that question. That is accurate with regards to the PSPC portfolio. Speaking to office space, so out of that 6.9, you have roughly 1 million square meters of special purpose space, warehouses, etc. And then you have another 6 million of general purpose office space. Out of that 6 million, you have embedded special purpose space, so not always pure office. But that is the PSPC portfolio. Speaking to the Government of Canada portfolio, I believe the number is more in the neighborhood of 23,000. So PSPC's share is roughly a quarter.
Okay, so 23 million, you're saying. Okay, so apologies for lowballing it significantly. Is it fair to say that the Government of Canada has experience in the area of managing real property?
I think that it would be fair to say that the Government of Canada has experience managing real property. That being said, of course, I can only speak to PSPC's portfolio.
Okay, I wanted to talk about some of the protocols and rules around the management of real property, including the directive on the management of real property, which states that acquiring property must be done in a manner that is fair and aligns with commercial real estate practices Is there any reason that you have to suspect that this part of the directive was not followed? Is there anything from what you've read, followed, that says that part of the directive was not followed when it comes to it being fair, the process being fair, and aligning with commercial real estate practices?
Answer that question. When we talk about fair, we talk about the fact that they looked at options based on the requirements, that there was a process to identify all properties, that they did market testing by engaging a broker, that they undertook an appraisal, and by aligned with commercial real estate practices, it would mean that they followed the legal due diligence process, the commercial practices in New York. What I know from what's been submitted to this committee is that they undertook an appraisal, that they engaged a broker, and my understanding from talking with officials at Global Affairs that they undertook a financial analysis of the options. That's what I know.
So is there any evidence from what you've seen to tell you that this part of the directive was not met? Is there any evidence that you've seen?
Given that the only information I have is what's been publicly available, I can only rely on what has been submitted to this committee.
Okay, so you haven't seen any evidence to the contrary that would contradict or violate the directive?
From what has been submitted, no, but I think the part of the evaluation of this committee is to make sure that GAC followed the policy, and I think that's
for sure. We'll follow up with GAC tomorrow, but today I just wanted, from your perspective, the directive on the management of real property highlights sound stewardship. Based on what you've read and seen, is there any evidence to say that that sound stewardship has not been followed?
I really do think that's a question for Global Affairs officials. They have the details of the transaction. I don't have access to all the details. What I have access to is what's been provided to this committee.
Right. I'm just asking you based on what you've seen. Based on what you've seen, has sound stewardship been followed from what you've seen?
I appreciate the question. I really do think Global Affairs officials need to answer that question.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
We'll go to you, Mr. Brock, please.
Is a feasibility study mandatory for the repair, renovation, or purchase of a diplomatic or official residence pursuant to Government of Canada policies?
Now you're testing me, but I would say if you're making a renovation, you would undertake an analysis, like it would be a project, so you would do the normal pre-project definition options analysis before you would get into the actual implementation.
So in relation to the existing property owned by the Government of Canada at 550 Park Avenue, before the decision was made to purchase West 57th, was a feasibility study prepared in relation to that transaction?
I don't know the answer to that question. That would be something that GAC officials would be able to answer, what they looked at in terms of the renovation cost.
Can anyone on this panel weigh in on that answer? Anybody? No? Okay. So in your opinion, Ms. Tattersall, would it be GAC who's responsible for the creation of a feasibility study if one was done pursuant to policy?
So yes, as the real property custodian, they would be responsible for looking at any sort of options analysis before undertaking a renovation.
Thank you. I know that there is a talking point that the purchase of the new property is smaller, it was more economical for the taxpayer, but very, very light in terms of details. I know the current property, the new property, is just under 3,600 square feet. What was the square footage of the property on Park Avenue? Anyone have an answer to that?
I don't know.
So thank you, Mr. Chair, for this. Oh,
thank you.
Sorry, Mark.
I'll defer to my colleague, Director General. Go ahead,
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. The subject property at 550 Park Avenue was 3,873 square meters.
3,800.
873.
So the new property is around 200 square feet or square meters less. Would that be your understanding?
Correct.
Okay. That is a very interesting answer because according to GAC, there is an impression they're giving Canadians that this new move represented a saving opportunity of more than $2 million for Canadian taxpayers, that it would also reduce ongoing maintenance costs and property taxes and support future program needs. The new property has a carrying cost per year of $235,896 US, which is probably just under $400,000 Canadian per year. Specifically, taxes, $10,000 US per month. Monthly common charges, just under $9,600 US dollars per month. Does anyone have any information with respect to the taxes and carrying costs on Park Avenue? Anyone?
No, I don't have access to those. I don't think PSPC would either, but I would expect that when they did their life cycle cost analysis, that the operating costs of both properties would have been taken into consideration.
The annual cost for this new property is more, and we just heard one of our colleagues from Fredericton, New Brunswick, is more than the actual purchase price of properties in her hometown. Do you not think this is a real problem with the government of Canada, that the taxpayers, we are paying out over $400,000 Canadian per year just to allow Justin Trudeau's buddy to live in luxury in Manhattan? Is that acceptable to you as a taxpayer? Not only are you civil servants, you're taxpayers. Is that acceptable to you?
So again, what I would say is that the official residence is acquired to support a mission in New York. So the requirements for that would be established by GAC pursuant to their legislation. So they acquire that to achieve their mission results in New York. So I don't have anything further than I can.
Sky's the limit, I guess, so long as it meets the mission's needs. That's what I'm hearing as a taxpayer.
No.
So long as it meets the mission needs, the cost be damned.
So consistent with Treasury Board policy, it is a balance. Best value is a balance between the real property meeting the operational requirements with the cost of the acquisition and the maintenance over the life cycle of the asset.
Thank you very much.
Those are the questions I have. Thank you.
Mr. Jory, do finish up, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Really don't have any more questions for TBS and PSPC, but I'm really looking forward to tomorrow's meeting when we start with GAC and talk about the real need. What was the need? What drove the need? When was this identified? How long did it take? What is the process? What at least is clear to me is that there were guidelines established by TBS. It's very clearly documented, and those has been communicated to many departments, and there are thresholds available. It is our job tomorrow to ask whether those were followed and question on that one. When I look at the document that's provided, 21 different properties were looked at. At least 12 of them looks like they're within threshold or below the threshold, and it looks like from the document that's provided, the choice that was selected, at least it's the cheapest one, and it yields the lowest dollar per square footage among all the choices. The questions around the previous residents, I think it's a valid question for us to get an understanding. Based on the document that's been given to us, it looks like the carrying cost, the difference between the carrying cost and net present value over a period of time yields at least $7.4 million in saving, which is equivalent to the price of somewhat close to the price of the condo. Those are the good questions that we're going to look forward asking, and and we'll be asking around the guidelines around valuation, both from the previous as well as the new. And probably it's a good question to ask, as far as sequencing, whether the cost of the sequencing were taken into account when the total net present value were calculated. So really, thank you, TBS, thank you, PSPC, for coming in and highlighting the guideline and your role into this. We're going to have a lot of good questions to ask GAC tomorrow. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Jory. Before we break up, there was a question of Ms. Vignola's earlier request about the appraisal. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think everyone's agreed that we'll ask for the appraisal. It'll come to the clerk, the analysts, and the MPs and associate MPs. Yes. Is that correct, everyone?
Yes. Associate MPs specifically, like Michael. Yeah.
I'm hearing no over there.
Associate MPs.
Could you just... Okay, while the Liberals are redeciding, and Ms. Vignola. Go ahead, Ms. Vignola.
Je sais pas si...
I don't know if time has done a number on my ears or if I just missed a few words, but what I'm hearing is this would be for MPs and then associate members, non-associate members, only committee members?
Okay.
So MPs and associate members only, no staff.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
And I'm acknowledging that Michael and Larry are associate members. They've been in this committee.
So we're fine with that? Great. Ms. Bouchard, I started asking before, is it right now, is the appraisal only in English, or is it English and French?
Le rapport d'évaluation est
The appraisal is only in English currently.
Wonderful. I think the committee was asking for it within 21 days, so consider that ordered. So we'll expect that to the clerk within, 21 days of whatever noon is, 21 days from now. Thank you very much.
Just one question.
Yeah.
There seems to be. Can we get clarification? It's the clerk of the committee or the law clerk that we're sending this to. Traditionally, what we've done. We've sent it
to go to the clerk, and she will send it to the analysts and the MPs.
Okay. She will no. Well, we will go to your office to review it, not send it.
No, my understanding was going to go to the MPs. Is that not what was agreed?
No, it was agreed that we will go to your office and we'll review it over there.
J'avais en effet compris qu'on irait au...
I also understood that we would go to the office with no notes, no phones, so that we could look over the documents in person. I understood that as well. This would ensure confidentiality and would also ensure that no leaks. That's how I mime it, leaks. Now, you and I have no doubt sold a property in our lives or known someone who has sold it. And there's a question of the municipal assessment versus the sales price. Everyone, of course, hopes that they will sell at a price that exceeds the assessment. That's what we hope for in this case as well. But if info gets out that one person doesn't care about a certain renovation, but another person really wants it, that could feed into the negotiation process for the sale. I was a homeowner at one point, and I know that it's important to have fair negotiations. We wouldn't want the part of the document to be leaked, making it so that the negotiations don't go as well as we want them to. I don't know how much the apartment is worth based on its size, based on its old money status on Park Avenue, based on its heritage nature. I imagine it would have a pretty high value. But I would be very uncomfortable if a leak got out, which influenced the negotiations about the price of the apartment. That is why we really need to make sure that confidentiality is respected. And that, in turn, is why I believed we had all agreed that we would look at the document in person in the clerk's office. We'll include members who tend to come to the committee, even if they are not permanent members. And this would happen when parliamentary proceedings resume, because 21 days is not a lot of time. This will give us the time to really go over the document. This was my understanding of the deal reached. And that, quite frankly, is what I would like to see happen so that we can avoid unintentionally influencing negotiations one way or another. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I do recognize the committees have the ability to set these sort of terms by which we would want to receive this information. I think it's highly unusual that when we call for production of a document that was referenced to by a witness, although several times the witness stated she could not speak to the particulars of the appraisal report, she did at times assume that we have seen it in some of her responses to Mr. Bacharach's questions. So we haven't seen the document. We've asked for the witness to produce those documents for the committee members only, and those who have been serving on this committee on a regular basis throughout some of these studies. I feel it's highly unusual to infer that members of Parliament would leak these kinds of documents for any purpose. We receive confidential documents all of the time. We have in the past in this committee. We've made sure that it is understood that when we are receiving these documents in confidence, we will not speak to them in committee. We've had those kinds of agreements at the head of receiving documents that are sensitive in nature, and requiring members of Parliament to visit the office of another MP in order to look at documents that they've been charged with being good stewards over to begin with. I mean, we deal with confidential information every day as a member of Parliament, and I think it undermines our integrity to insist that this document would not be held in the strictest of confidence by the members of Parliament who are serving on this committee.
Thanks. I saw your hand up, Mrs. Vignola, then Mr. Jory.
Bonjour, merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to correct a few things here so that we can all be on the same page. We wouldn't be going to the office of another MP to see the document. It would be the office of the clerk. This is what is done regularly in Parliament. Yes. A second point. The appraisal report that Ms. Bouchard referenced today was the one that we did receive this week. It was 97 pages, plus some more pages of letters from Global Affairs. It was the appraisal report on the 57th Street residence, the new residence. What we are currently asking for is the appraisal report for the former residence, which is currently up for sale. Yes, very frequently, we do work with confidential information. Has confidential information been leaked to the media in the past? Well, in the past, there have been a few surprises, I'll put it that way. To be polite about it. When we get documents by email, I mean, I keep my personal email and my MP email separately. No one touches my personal emails. My employees know that well. I need to know what my constituents are saying, whether they're in a good mood, a bad mood, what they think about a given act. I would certainly not want an employee wishing to help me manage my emails to accidentally stumble across a confidential document. But this is how I manage my emails. I don't know how everyone does it. I don't know how things work in other offices. I'm not about to say that my colleagues can't be trusted. No, on the contrary. I know the way I do things. No one goes into my emails. I'm normally a permissive person, but when it comes to my emails, I'm very controlling. Very. I don't know if that's the case for everyone. It is in that perspective that I have certain concerns about a possible leak. That someone might accidentally come across a document and that person might not be entitled to view it. This could happen for any number of reasons. Maybe the person isn't aware that a certain document is confidential. I'm not going to say, you are going to leak a document or you are going to leak a document. Not at all. I'm just trying to make sure that we work according to the usual practices, because it's relatively normal that people would go to a clerk's office to look at a document. This has been done in the past with contracts. The last thing I would want would be to insult anyone. That's not how I do things. That's not how I'm going to do things. I'm just trying to make sure that we have a proper pricing for something that we are putting up for sale. Any homeowner would want the same information. That's it. Thank you. And I hope that my clarifications suffice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to confirm that my understanding of the conversation we had is exactly what Julie just reiterated. And I reiterate again, the document in both official languages goes to the clerk's office, the committee clerk's office. A copy is provided for each MP and key associate members, as I call it, such as Michael and Larry, who have attended numerous times and is actually considered permanent members of this committee, will attend, will review. No notes, no camera, no anything, and then the copy is destroyed thereafter, and naturally the analyst and the chair has the privilege of looking at those documents as well, also I look at it from there's always a possibility of a breach. There's a lot of phishing going on, and this document's being on somebody's P9 account, it could get phished. That's why we do what we do. And also look at the precedents. The precedents basically look at all the contracts, such as the EV battery contract that we had. We went to the clerk's office, we looked at it, our copies was prepared for us. We were given ample time to look at it, and then it was destroyed. And so when you look at the precedents, when you look at the security, and look at the agreement that we have, I think we have a winner. We're going to get to the answer. We're going to be able to see it in a secured way. It's going to be in both official language. It's going to be in the clerk's office, and it's going to give the answer to the questions that we have. Win-win.
Mr. Barrett?
Thank you.
We're certainly trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube after unanimously agreeing to something different than what's now being discussed. But we have members. I mean, we need to have an understanding here. Do we have people who are joining this committee from other parts of the country, or do we not? And we do. And so it's 2024. It's very easy to do remote viewing. So for members are going to have to schedule an appointment with the clerk to view this document. They should be able to do that from their secured House of Commons devices, where she can display the clerk, or the clerk acting in her place can display it on her screen and share that screen with members. That technology exists within the enterprise solutions that the House of Commons uses. So it's not 1995. We don't need to walk over to the clerk's office and read what got faxed over to her. It's going to get emailed to the clerk. So if members are worried about phishing, it's been emailed all around government email addresses, and it's going to be emailed to the clerk. If it's only members of Parliament who, again, can't be trusted, I have a lot more confidence in my colleagues than it seems that other members do. But it is what you said, though. You said that you were worried about it being being fished. So if that's the concern, then we could go back to just having documents hand carried and not having them emailed. But the document's going to be transmitted electronically, so it's going to be sent, and it has been, and it's going to be sent to the clerk. And so that's been done. We should be able to view it. Members, there are members in a variety of circumstances that they've been permitted to join electronically. I won't enumerate what those reasons are. They should also be able to access this document from where they're able to access this meeting. So that technology exists. So we can let this go, though it's absurd, if we can enable members to access the document remotely through the clerk. Simultaneously, then I think that satisfies all of the concerns. As though I don't agree with with the arguments that have been proposed. This would allow for all members to be able to see the documents from wherever they were joining the meeting from.
Sure.
Mr. Brock?
So I listened very carefully to my colleague, Mr. Barrett, and that's exactly the topic and the solution that I was going to present, remote viewing. I'm also mindful that our colleague, Mr. Jawari, had indicated not officially, but certainly clear enough and loud enough that I could hear it, that was not what he was against. So perhaps we should clarify from Mr. Jawari and the Liberal position on this, because let's face it, we have hybrid parliament, and we have hybrid proceedings in committee. To deny a remote member who chooses because of life circumstances or distance, my colleague Mr. Genuis has some personal issues. Mr. Bacharach from the great province of British Columbia is choosing to save taxpayer dollars and participate remotely. Are we expected to throw convention out the window and policy out the window just to ensure that people are here in person? I think Mr. Barrett's solution is a sound one, and I hope that Mr. Jawari would think that would be an appropriate solution, an exception to the rule that he's proposing. So perhaps I'd like to hear from Mr. Jawari as to those members, whether they be permanent members or associate members who participate on a regular basis at the mighty OGGO, whether they can participate remotely to review the document.
Just a point of order, Chair.
I'm going to take the floor.
Just with respect to Mr. Brock's comments and Mr. Genis's issues, I'd like to congratulate our colleague Garnet and his wife Rebecca on the birth of their 6th child, and that as good a reason as any to not join us in person. So Isidore, Carlo, Richard, Genis, And I think that I just want to congratulate Garnet and thank his wife for letting us borrow Garnet for a couple hours today while we deal with this important issue.
Thank you. Yes, congratulations to your family, Mr. Genuis. I think you being with us is more of an issue for us than the new baby being an issue. But colleagues, I had put this issue forward as looking for a UC for it. We don't have it, so I am going to suggest that perhaps someone put it forward as a proper motion for the next meeting, and we can perhaps work out some arrangement before then. I would have to agree with some issues brought up. It's unfair to Mr. Bachrach, Mr. Genuis, anyone else who is not coming in person to not have access to it. So perhaps we can get as a proper motion. I'm going to adjourn, Miss. Go ahead.
J'ai une toute petite question.
I have a small question. I just want to check something. When the clerk sends us a link to SharePoint, is SharePoint secure, confidential, impenetrable to the public?
Sent. For example, when we order documents, those are considered public unless deemed confidential. So some of the SharePoint that we received over the years has been pre-decided by us in advance to be confidential, not to be shared. Others, if it's too large to do the usual PDF and it's done as a SharePoint, if it's an order for documents, they're considered public. But for example, she could send by SharePoint or PDF that. But as I said, thank you, witnesses, for appearing today. Mr. Quinlan, thanks for being here virtually. We are adjourned.